Hey everybody, welcome back. We're with our essay specialist again today, and today we're going to talk about UC Insight questions. Everybody on the call today has a lot of experience with this. So before we dive into the particulars, I want to just start out with some broad context for those who might be watching who don't really know that much about the UC Insight questions. Essentially, what we have are 8 questions, as we can see here, and these 8 questions are each prompts that you have to write 250 to 350 words for, and you have to pick 4 out of the 8. And we'll dig more into these as we go. But what the goal of this is for the UCs to get a broad understanding of who you are. So we're going to talk about today are ways to use those 4 different essays to give the best kind of mosaic of your personality and your passions and your directions in your life and what you want to do. And also to kind of debunk some of the things that we hear. We're not going to call out any local high schools or any local counselors, but one of the things that we hear quite often from our students, word on the street as we call it, is are our students saying, my counselor says that for the UC essays, I'm not supposed to be creative. I'm just supposed to answer the prompt directly. I hear this again and again, and we'll go around and we'll hear what you guys hear. But one of the things that this, I try to separate this for the students and say, yes, you need to respond to these prompts. You need to give a direct answer, but this doesn't mean you can't be creative. As we have many storytellers on, this call, a lot of us know about, I think every one of us knows about exposition and getting information out. And there's a way, the character, which is the writer in this case, of the story, that the essay that they're writing, is getting out information about themselves. It doesn't have to be done in a boring way. So we're going to talk about is how to answer these prompts and how not to fall prey to that, cliche of, just answer the question as if this is a high school writing assignment. You're not getting a letter grade. This is more like poetry of the soul. This is something where it's supposed to come out from your heart and supposed to kind of come out in a way that affects the admissions officers. So I want to, anybody, you guys have your names up. You don't have to do the icebreaker, like little hand up there thing. But if everybody can, or anyone that wants to chime in, and what are some of the preconceptions, because we always start with preconceptions, what are some preconceptions that you think students have about, about the UC personal insight questions? Anyone want to start?
I'll start.
Get it, Kevin. Jump in there, Kevin. Get in that pool.
I think sometimes there's a sense that, I think you said something interesting about it's a mosaic is what they're looking for. I think sometimes people don't necessarily understand that going in, is that they need 4 different topics and 4 different parts of themselves, both in the sense of, literally topics. You don't want to have 4 essays about playing baseball or playing football, but you also don't want to have 4 essays that are just there to show how hard you work. It's great to work really hard, but we want to show other things as well, right? So I think sometimes people don't come in with the sense that this is really 4 different things that fit together, so that it's not one big thing and it's not 4 completely separate things. They tie in without having any overlap necessarily.
The description I use is it's like a color palette. Color palettes aren't absolutely differentiated, different colors. They are colors that work together as a whole, right? Whether it's like a paint palette for a room, eyeshadow palette, whatever it is, it's a chosen set of colors. When somebody talks about baseball in 4 of their essays, they're like, they coach baseball, they got injured in baseball, they love baseball, like that's all their baseball thing. That's 4 colors of brown. That doesn't really create much of a palette. And we're looking for a palette that works together, but also expresses different colors. So how do you guys talk to your students about kind of getting those, differentiations, and maybe give some specific examples? And the baseball was a good one. I think about the student, and I know, Matt, for sure, has dealt with students who want to do like musical theater or drama, and they want to write 4 essays about that, and we're like, that's awesome that you love it, but also maybe limit that to 2, and maybe make those 2 colors, bright green and like forest green, or like lime green and forest green, ugly colors. And then find two other colors for other things that you're interested in. But how do you guys go about speaking about, finding that palette or mosaic? Anybody?
I think it can be useful to back into the prompts a little bit. I like to talk about the mosaic ahead of time rather than focusing on the prompts and thinking about what could the response be for each one of these, and instead thinking about, okay, what would you like the UCs to know about you, and what are some a variety of different colors that we can use to fill out your palette. And yeah, sometimes the focus, I've worked with a student who figure skating is really her life. And so we decided to choose, okay, we have two different aspects of figure skating we can talk about to address two of these prompts. And I think having, we're not saying that you can't address the same topic twice, especially if it's very important to you. And there's a way to address the same topic and still show two very different colors. But I think it's useful to come from a point of view of, what do I want to say, and what are the things that are important to me to show the school, before looking at the prompts and thinking, okay, like what can my response be to each one of these 8 prompts? I think that's sometimes an easier and more effective way to approach it.
I think that's exactly right. That's the way we do the personal statements, right? We don't say, look at these, 7 prompts and kind of see how you'd answer each one of them. It's like, think about yourself first, think about what you want to express, and see how those things land into different shaped peg holes. And obviously, I think everyone on this call has enough experience where you've had a student that wants to write about, like in Hannah's case here, where she said they backed into it. The student wants to write about playing guitar. And you're like, is that your creative side, or is that your greatest talent or skill? And then, or is that an educational barrier? Like, we'll find different ways to kind of say things, but I think Hannah's right. What are those things you want to say about yourself? Anyone else, like, what other things that you see that they're doing when they're first coming at this and they don't understand what they need to do?
I feel like, in contrast to the mosaic of just like trying to have different, palettes, people try to like have too many palettes. Like, they will just look at their activities list and be like, okay, like, how can I get everything in here? Like, I guess a greatest skill could capture these 5 activities. And it's like, okay, it's like, again, the mosaic of the whole application. Like, yeah, some activities are definitely worth going into, especially if like they mean a lot to you, but also like, what are things that they're not getting from that activities list?
It's interesting you say that. Well, first of all, for people that are watching, there is a distinction between like the Common App and the UC app. The UC app actually gives students quite a bit of room to describe their activities. Some of them have 2 boxes where you can describe how you got into this or what was required, and then what you learned from it. So they give you mini essays to write over there. And so when we see students taking those same exact things and almost kind of cutting and pasting them and using them for the essays, it's like, why did you do that? And dummy, just kidding. But David, you said, like, you notice students trying to fold in 2 or 3 activities into a single 350 word prompt. And for those that don't know it, 350 words is about half a page single space, maybe a little bit less. So, you have to kind of shoulder them off of that and say, like, try to settle down into one thing. But I think that's a really relevant point, is the activity list in conjunction with the essays, and not seeing them as 2 separate worlds. But they are, again, like I think Kevin, you said that they lock together and they kind of become a picture. So do any of you guys kind of go around the horn with your students, like essays, activities, back to essays, and kind of have like these pieces communicating to each other in a sense? Does anyone like kind of like, or look at the activities and kind of draft from them? Anybody? Or anybody else want to add in something? Like,
No, I mean, I think that for me, the students I feel like I'm the most effective with are when we have the opportunity to do exactly what you just said. We work on the personal statement, and then we get tired of that and we cycle over to the activities, and it's a way to be able to see the application as a whole, which is exactly how the admissions officer will look at it. And it's a great way to remember, no one piece needs to do everything, that it is a cohesive document. So yes, that's the ideal a way to approach the application, is to be able to look at it as a whole and see how the pieces work together.
And you did mention, Hannah, the personal statement, and I know the essay specialists all have thoughts about this, because the major thing our students, we're in California, the major things our students have to deal with is the Common App personal statement or the coalition, which are both like 550, 650 words. Some of the schools have made it 650, so they're exactly the same. And then the UC insight questions. There are supplement essays as well. But what do you guys notice to be the pathway from, I don't know what I'm writing about, to working on the personal statement, and then the personal insight questions? Because it's one long one and four shorties. Do you start out with the four shorties and with the UCs and help that build your personal statement? Do you do the other way around? Like, what's the relationship between the personal statement and the UC insight questions? Anyone?
Yeah, I like to start with the UCs almost always, because they are a little bit more direct, right? Or at least they provide some more structure in how we go about figuring out what we're going to write about and providing you some topics to think about. So like, it's a good way to get to know a student also. So I can get to know what you care about and where you spend your time through these UCs, and then we can kind of build off of that when we head into the personal statement.
And Matt, when you see the personal statement and the UCs, how do you see them connect in the final product? Sometimes, or is the personal statement a combination of them? Is the personal statement like overexposed one of them? Like, how do you see?
Yeah, I mean, look, it could be any combination of those things. Sometimes I have, there's one UC that really is the thing, right? And that ends up being like a more blown out version of that could be your personal statement. Or if you've worked on personal statement with us, we talk about vertical with horizontal. Sometimes there's a theme between your UCs. I mean, ideally there is. And if there is, there's a way to connect 2 or 3 of those maybe and represent those in the personal statement. But another reason I like starting with the UCs is not only ammo for the personal statement, but ammo for the supplements. When you start working through your Common App application, if we have these really strong 350 word answers to lean back on, we have plenty of ammunition to hit supplements along the way. And I find that that's like really like super valuable for me as I help students.
Yeah. Anyone else want to kind of like piggyback off that and how you see the interaction between the shorties and the long one and the supplements as well? Anyone?
Yeah, I think that what Matt said about one kind of becoming blown out, I feel like along the line, there's usually one you see that almost feels like electric when a student's writing it. They're just like, oh, this one just felt so much easier than the rest. Yeah. And yeah, like I also think just like not even with the UCs, but working with us overall, like students writing ideally is going to be getting better. So it's like, it's almost like the UCs are like a build up to that personal statement. It's like, I usually find the third and fourth UC to be better than the first one in a way that the first one almost gets iterated again after that. But yeah, usually like once they've done the third or fourth UC, they're like, okay, they feel a little bit more confident for what they can do with the personal statement.
Yeah, and I think structurally, because a lot of students, we're all structuralists, so we understand, what it takes to make something sustain itself over a long period of time. The UCs, I always say, are like planks across streams. Like they're just very, as Matt used the word, direct. Like, like I can answer it and then I'm done. The personal statement is like a suspension bridge. You have to get students to sustain themselves all the way. The screenwriters in the group know it's the second act lag, or, they're trying to get across that middle of that territory that does tend to droop a little bit structurally. And the personal statement needs a more kind of solidified structure, and sometimes working on those shorties kind of develops a voice that I think that is able to then handle structure better, even though those things aren't necessarily interrelated all the time. But I think what David, would you say it's confidence they gain over that, or do you think it's self-exploration? Like what is it that, or is it just getting better?
I think it's a combination of both, honestly, because yeah, it's like a lot of these students are coming from a place where they've only done academic writing, like argumentative essays or like analyzing rhetorical devices. So like this is really kind of their first dip into creativity. So like at first it can be like a little scary, or a lot of students can feel like they're not doing it right. But once they know that, okay, like we are moving along, I am capable of doing this, then they feel more capable of building that suspension bridge. But yeah, but also it's again rallying off what Matt said. Sometimes they get to one where they're like, okay, this I can write about a lot more than 350 words.
Right. That portends that in the future that it might be a personal statement essay. Um, Any other, before we go into the specific prompts, anyone else, Melissa, anyone have any kind of thoughts of things that you notice that students preconceive coming in that maybe makes them write in a certain way that maybe not directly or exactly what they should be doing? I don't know if that question is kind of, yeah, Melissa?
I'll say I find a really common issue is that a student will see this as an opportunity to list their resume or to just to say all of the things that they're good at, say all of the things they know how to do. And they don't take the time to understand that this also can be an emotional process. This can also be a moment to connect with someone. And I think that's something that only comes when you do that mix of personal statement and then UCs, and then they start to realize, oh, these are kind of the same thing. I can play around with it the same way.
And they can find themselves a little bit, right?
Yeah, totally.
Think about like if you were to write, one paragraph of who you are today, or half a page of who you are today. You could write that 15 days in a row and write a different paragraph every single day. And one of those 15 will be great. And maybe 2 will be good and 13 or 12 will be terrible. My addition, subtraction, it'd be terrible. So it's also the idea of writing and rewriting, right? I think that students, first of all, let's call the elephant out in the room. The UCs don't have teacher recommendations. They don't, in many cases, look at senior year grades. They don't have supplements in addition to their main essays, unless it's a specific program. So there's a lot of weight on these. And when students are too often just kind of getting it done, and if the UCs are your primary target, you should be writing these 3 to 10 times each, like rewriting them, turning them inside out, starting different way, seeing how you can reconnect the pieces. Maybe try to write, I don't know, I'm sure you guys have all seen this. A student will write 6 different prompts and then just pick the best 4 that come out of it. But let's jump into the prompts here, and we'll just go one by one. So if we look here, the first one, it says here, describe an example of your leadership experience in which you have positively influenced others, helped to resolve disputes, or contributed to group efforts over time. So describe an example of your leadership experience. Okay, so when you guys talk to your students about this one, what are some of the keynotes that you might tell them? Leadership experience. Do they have to be ASB vice president? Do they have to be, the founder of a, link crew or something? What do you guys kind of how do you help them qualify the concept of what a leader is?
Yeah, I always tell them that, being a leader doesn't necessarily imply having a title, but it does imply having a group of people that you're working with, so get them thinking about what communities or what groups they're part of and what position they're in that, if it is a leadership position, and also just thinking about, what kind of leader are you? If you are one, if you're not, then yeah, this prompt, might be tougher, but for the most part, people are in at least some format, right? I mean, I see a lot about being a big brother, being a coach, being a, coach on the field, right? Et cetera. And so while that is good that are a lot of natural leadership positions that people find themselves in and can write about, that also makes those even more important to write about them in an interesting way that highlights, again, what kind of leader you are, what's the experience of being a leader like for you, highlights their personhood and their subjectivity in a way that's not just listing accomplishments or giving examples of leadership experiences.
Right, because if they're talking about being a leader and they are the, vice, treasurer of National Charity League or something like that, or I don't know if it's a leadership position, but they're in some leadership position in a club, that's on their activity page. That's already represented. And they already had to write about that in there. So if they're going to just repeat that, that's a lost opportunity. So as Kevin said, there are a lot of different types of leadership that people, you know, are a part of that don't necessarily know it and or don't know how to express it. I had one student who talked about being the leader of his family. He's like, my parents wouldn't agree, but I'm the leader of this family. And he started out and he said his first example was when the dog swallowed poison. Everyone else was panicking. He said, my dad looked like he was going to cry. You know, everyone was this. He goes, I was on my phone Googling what to do, and we were able to get the poison extracted by having them, drink this oil and throw up. And, I led that. And there are other times I do that too. When there's kind of chaos, I get settled and I figure out what to do. And he made other examples as well. Some people are leaders of their friends. They're the ones that are like, hey, we need to do this. I even had one student say they're the leader. It sounds a little bit, soft, but they're the leader of like when they play on RPGs online, and they're always the one that are commanding all these different things. And they say, like some people may think that this is not a leadership position. He goes, but whatever group I'm in, I'm always the one that emerges as the leader of that group. And he was a very compelling little essay. Can you guys think of any examples where your students found leadership in a unique way or in a way that kind of the students may not be recognizing themselves until someone scratches below the surface and gets there? Anybody have any leadership things?
Yeah, I think the second part of the prompt is really useful. It talks a lot about thinking about an experience where you influenced a group. So yeah, where you positively influenced others, resolved disputes, or contributed to group efforts. So exactly, you don't need a title. It might be a dispute among your friends that you were able to help broker. And maybe you aren't normally the de facto leader of your friends, but in that situation, when there was a dispute, the student was able to step up and make a difference. And so I think it's if you have a leadership experience that jumps to mind, fantastic. But I think it's very possible to assume that role of leadership even temporarily and have that be a really worthwhile experience that's worth relaying for this prompt.
Yeah, and go ahead, David.
I was just going to rally on two things that I feel like are going to pop up throughout all the essays, like one being dynamics and two being the things to consider questions. Going off what Hannah was saying with the second part of the prompt that says like, oh, what was like a moment or an experience where you positively contributed, and going off even what you were saying, Scott, with like the moment with the dog poisoning, right? I feel like a lot of times students get caught up in this like capital L leadership idea of like, okay, I'm pretty much just gonna say what my activities say, like what I did with the group, but they really forget about what they do with individuals, or that a group is a combination of individuals, or that leadership is not just like, again, what they put on the activities. It is like little moments of positive contribution. So I feel like having that range in the essay of like moment and maybe things that they do more overall is really important. Second thing,
under that one, would you say that you're trying to have a student find multiple points that kind of fit into like their definition of a leader rather than like title? So it's like they have to kind of find those things, like the dog poisoning or.
Exactly. And that rallies perfectly with even the thing to consider question of that prompt that I think is really, really helpful for just spawning creativity. It's how has your perception of leadership changed over time? I think that's a great question for all students to be meditating on. Like, and with all the prompts, there's some really thought-provoking questions on each of them. So I feel like those are not to be forgotten also.
Awesome. Anyone else about leaders? So let's jump to the next one, which is every person has a creative side, and it can be expressed in many ways. Problem solving, original innovative thinking, and artistically, to name a few. Describe how you express your creative side. So I don't know about you guys, but I'll sit with a lot of students and the first thing they say is like, I don't paint, I don't, play any instruments. And you're like, so is that it? And then you kind of got to dig a little bit deeper. But what is your experience about mining for creativity and the different ways that it can be found in your students, and kind of maybe, make them aware of their own creativity? Anybody?
I think problem solving helps students. Honestly, I have a lot of students who are creative for this one, but for the ones who aren't, like, I think like finding something they're passionate about. Like, I'm thinking about a student who wanted to be an engineer and was into robotics, but way more into the coding of robotics and didn't feel very creative. But then we talked about, like, well, what happens before a competition? Everything gets crazy and you're putting everything together. Like, how do you problem solve in that situation?
When failures come up.
Right. So I think there's a lot to be said about thinking about what you're passionate about and how you push yourself in that passion.
My dad was an engineer, and my mom was like an artist, a painter. And my mom would always say that my dad was more creative than she was. And I'm like, no way. I'm like, dad wears a tie to work, and dad, like does this. And she's like, no, he's always thinking of creative things like MacGyver. And, like that's kind of like what you're talking about, is like, just because your hair's not painted blue or dyed blue, paints the hair, your hair's not dyed blue, and you're not wearing two different colored shoes, and piercings, it doesn't mean that you're not creative. He could be the robotics kid that's like solving problems. I described the other day, there's the old, it might be kind of an urban myth, but a tractor trailer got stuck in like a tunnel, and it couldn't get through. And they realized if they tried to back the tractor trailer up, it would pull the bridge apart, and they didn't know what to do. And then like a little boy was like, let the air out of the tires, and then it'll just go lower, and it'll be able to be pulled out. And that's absolutely creative, but it's not something that someone would think is creative. Any other things that you guys have thought about, like, or talk to your students about being creative?
Cooking comes up in this one sometimes. A lot of kids have a baking hobby, like they make cookies, or they like to look up recipes online, or even YouTube. So that's something that's definitely come up for me in this prompt. Or even how you view a sport can be creative, right? So like the way you pass. I think I helped a kid once with the way he passes in soccer, or the way he thinks about passing in soccer. So really it could be anything, right? Like all these questions is just about your point of view, which if I'm going to go for 1 sec, I just want to go back to why this is important to do some free writing before you start jumping in, right? Because if you do the straightforward approach for this, you can be like, one thing about my creative side is like, we're never going to get there if we just have that entry point. So I think it's important to think about how you feel about things before you start writing.
I think the soccer passing essay could be totally, solid. Someone could say, like, the opening line could be something like, I see openings where others don't, and about passing and stuff like that. And that's, you can kind of build out like a whole thing. I call that a protocol statement. Like, it's like their kind of beginning thing that they can then kind of almost prove through the rest of it. But the soccer essay is something that student probably would have never thought of that being creative until you kind of had them do the free writing. You had them arrive at that. I've had one student talk about their socks. I have, girls talk about makeup and using it. Like, people may think makeup is, superficial and, about vanity, but I see it as an art form. And there are all sorts of things that people can do. Fashion, music. And I always say that if there's something that you're doing, try not to kind of just make it sound like creative in a way that we already know that you would be going. That's non-creative in its own right. Like saying, I'm very creative. I paint and I use a lot of crazy colors. I use all different things. I'm creative. It's like, are you though? Any last words on creativity?
So the other similar pitfall to that is listing too many influences, just getting way too caught up in, what your creative journey is in terms of how you've progressed from wanting to make, animated films to this, and why this has changed. And that's great, but if it's too much about moving from Tim Burton to, I don't know, Tom Holland or something, I guess he's just an actor, then that's,
we get it.
You get it. You get what I'm going for. then it's not centered enough around you. So that can still be a problem with the creative essays too, I think.
Yeah, and I love that essay. We'll talk about the ones that the UCs probably latch on to a little bit more, but I think for a lot of people that is a very interesting one. And it sometimes gets mixed up with the next one. What would you say is your greatest talent or skill? Because if someone, you know, if they're a musician, then they might talk about writing songs here, and then they might talk about playing guitar here or piano here. And if we're talking about the mosaic of colors or the palette, that might be, you know, as long as they don't kind of hit that, you know, note or that color again, they might be fine. But what would you say, and maybe even in context that we were just talking about, how would you help a student with, what would you say is your greatest talent or skill? How have you developed and demonstrated that talent over time? You know, is there, oops, screwing up the things here, buddy. So greatest talent or skill, what would you, how do you go about kind of mining your students for this one, besides the free write, and once they kind of come up with some ideas? Anybody?
This is one I think can, again, like a little bit like the leadership prompt, can make you kind of zero in a little bit on your activities or on your, maybe what your major is. You want to use this as an opportunity to talk about, to pitch yourself. And I always encourage students to maybe take a step back and think about, I think it's a great place to show your personality. I have a student writing that his greatest skill is forgiveness. And I think that it doesn't need to be a physical skill that generates a product. It can absolutely be part of your background. It can be a way to talk about your family, your heritage. I think there's a lot of different ways to approach this prompt beyond just, I know how to build motorcycles, for example. But that could be a really interesting one too.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Celeste, were you going to say something?
Oh, yeah. A little bit different though. So I was thinking about, I had a student, and this is actually one of my favorite UC essays I've read ever, who like she didn't have something she latched onto in high school, and she had really tried. So when we were talking about this one, she's like, I don't have anything here. She's like, I've done all these things and like nothing stuck. And she kind of felt like she'd tried so hard because she thought like that's what colleges wanted to see. And we kind of just kept digging into that. And I was like, okay, so you're like really into science. Like, you're like worked so hard, showing like hard work and research and all these things. And she kind of turned this into something about like using the scientific method and how she'd kept trying, and then doing so, like she'd bettered her research skills. So I think,
what would you tag that talent as, like as a researcher?
Yeah, as researching. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of, so go ahead.
Yeah, so I think sometimes when people get scared that there's nothing there, if they dig a little deeper, they can find they still have done something along the way.
It's almost like that last essay that we talked during the personal statements about the girl who cracked the eggs and realized that process was the most important thing to her. It's kind of like, it's almost like in the arc, in the search, they find what they're looking for, which is their ability to search. You know, it's like in a weird way. You know, talent or skill. You know, I know some people that say like they're their friend's therapist. You know, like that remind me of like what you're talking about, like forgiveness. I just go around forgiving people all the time. You know, like, but you know, like there are you know, people that are like, and with these, a lot of times you need to kind of get in there quick. You need to let the reader know that this is not something that is kind of obvious, that you're going to state it from the beginning. You know, like whenever my friends have a problem, you know, they come to me. You know, it's a boring sentence, but it, you know, at least in a structural thing, it tells us kind of what we're going to get out of this, which is this student's skill is that they probably listen, they probably give honest feedback, and they probably help people, and they have a desire to help. So all these things can kind of like come off like tentacles out of that original thought. Anyone else have any kind of unique pathways that people have taken through this one, David?
Yeah, one that I always think about, and I know that you worked with a student also, Scott. One student last year wrote about how her grade school is braiding hair,
Yeah.
and I guess I want to serve that as like a, it's not like an abstract skill like creating safe spaces or forgiveness. It's not quite like a I'm really good at painting, I'm really good at running. It's something in between. And the thing that I found interesting about it was that, well, one, I had never had anyone ever write about braiding hair, but two, it was like her way of like showing how deep she could go into something because it like related to her passion for Greek and Roman myths. Like it came from this myth, this gal going against this god and then beating her and then becoming a spider, and she wanted to be this girl anyway. But it all goes to say that then she wanted to major in classics, so it tied really well with her major. But the whole thing is, so on the surface it was about being good at braiding hair, but on the much deeper note it was about her grade skill was just going full force into what she really cared about, and like not being self-conscious about it, which I thought was really awesome.
It was awesome. And also, I would say even a third part got added to that essay because she said that people would come up to her during lunch and get their hair braided. And she almost became, again, the therapist. She would say like people would come in. So that, and, we might as well break into this right now, which is the concept of paragraphs in UC essays. So many students, when they come to Blue Train or they ask us to read an essay that they just wrote and it's just one big glob of words, and UC's train readers, and these readers are getting these, a student with 4 insight questions that are just 4 fugly paragraphs. And when I get those even to read, I'm already like, ugh. And I'm like, all right, let me try to disentangle this mentally. But an essay like the one you're talking about, the hair braiding one, she started out with like the tale of where braiding comes from, then how deeply she gets into braiding. She talks about all the intricacies of braiding, and then what braiding leads her to get from other people in terms of relationships. And that was 3 terms in 350 words, 3 paragraphs. And, I know we all talk enough to know that our students usually do 2 or 3 paragraphs for the UC Insight questions. Not to try to sound like a 3-act structuralist, but beginning, middle, and end of an essay, whatever order you want to put those parts in. I just feel like if students think about how these mini paragraphs are going to turn, they tend to think more expansively about the idea itself, rather than just, I'm going to try to get in one idea and kind of bring it through. They're like, I have to break braiding into 3 different things or 2 different things. What would those things be? And I know that, the student in question, was very nervous about all these essays. And she was like, this isn't a good idea, but we're talking about it today because it became a great idea, right? Anything else about, like, because I know that we'll kind of, talk quickly at the end about polish, but anything else about, since we're on this topic, about paragraph structures or about how to talk to your students not to have, like, as I call it, the glob, Anybody? Like, do you guys kind of tell your students? Melissa, look like you're going to say something.
Yeah. Something that I talk about is, because you have even less room than you have on the personal statement, you have to work in a clear structure, because if you don't, you don't have any room to maneuver around into what you're trying to say. You have to get to the point as quickly as possible. So not that structure isn't important in the personal statement, but I think it's even more important in these ones, just because there's so little wiggle room.
It's almost like a short film versus like a feature film. Like these like short films, like they need to turn on a dime quicker. I'm sure you guys have all had this experience where a student gives you a glob and they go, "This is me," and you're like, you read it and you're like, the first 6 sentences could be totally cut. Like, let's not talk about how you got the job at Camp Escapades. Let's not talk about what it is. Let's just start out with you with paint on your face, running around with kids chasing you, and how fun it is. Like, let's start in the moment and then backfill expositionally where we are, what we're doing, but we already have that. And then the reader is already hooked because they're in the environment with you. they know your feelings about it, and then you can kind of move more quickly. But I agree with you, Melissa, that it is kind of, it's like a feat of structure to get these little things kind of, you know, done really well and to move. And when I read 4 really well-structured, well-polished UC essays, like they're game changers. You know, we have enough exit data from our students about where they got accepted, what their numbers were, whether it's GPAs, SATs, or ACTs, to know that these do make a difference. A lot of things make differences, but these definitely make differences. Let's look at the next one really quickly. It says, describe how you have taken advantage of an educational opportunity or worked to overcome an educational barrier. I would say probably, I'm going to throw this out there, that this one is more of something that we have to less inspire people to think about and warn them off of certain things. Like they're like, oh, you know, I had ADD and then I take medication and that's my educational barrier. I'm like, that you're taking a pill to get over now? And I'm like, maybe if you're going to talk about that, maybe talk about how the pill affected you, like go deeper on that story. Just because if it's just ADHD pill cured, like I don't really know, that might be better off in the additional comments after your academic section, that you can kind of contextualize your grades that way. But don't use your essays here in a way that can be really colorful to kind of like almost like antiseptically describe what happened. But what are your feelings when you talk about educational barriers or educational opportunities with your students, and to kind of get the best out of this one? And is this even a popular one? Okay.
Same thing that you're saying, just to hit it again, like I think it applies to all of these, but proactive choices, things that you do, that you've done, steps that you're taking in all of these things, right? Because like that's more interesting to me. Like, okay, how did you start doing your homework differently after you took that pill? Did you start organizing your week or your schedule differently? Did you subtract some activities out of your life? That is telling me about you, right? Like that's me getting to know you, and I'm infinitely more interested in that than I am in something that, you know, happened to you. So I think it applies to almost all of these essays, right? Like if we have an inciting incident, like it's not like, we don't want to hear autobiography of like a recap of events, like something happened and then show me what you did in response to that thing happening.
Right. Like the proactive, like the active, you know, hero in a sense, you know. Anyone else about this one?
Yeah, I think people are weirdly, especially the educational opportunity seems less popular than a lot of the other question types. I think maybe people see barrier and then stick with the negative instead of the positive for whatever reason. But I mean, I've seen good ones about both. I think really that's my notice. I think people should give opportunity more of a chance. You know, I've had students remember, you know, that they went on like a student exchange program in Mexico, and it's like that's an educational opportunity where you know, got to learn about a lot of different things in a way you wouldn't have otherwise. You know, why? So people think very negatively with essays in general, I think, and especially
I
this
think
one.
that's a good point, because that kind of harkens back to the idea of people thinking they need to have like a sob story. In full disclosure, the UCs do have something called a hardship index. When a student has faced hardship, they do get an extra kind of like boost to their application. Just like if they're the first in their family to go to college, they get a boost. If they're from a socioeconomically underserved area, they get a boost. So hardships do have boosts, but barriers that are not actual hardships almost get like a, come on, you know, like the girl who like fell on her rollerblades type story. But educational opportunities, if it's not, and I love that you said that, because I think that's true, because a lot of students do kind of, the students that don't feel creative or have a great skill and they're just like but they might have learned something by, you know, going to work with their uncle one summer, even though it's not on their activity list, they just had this opportunity to learn. I bet you if we all had to take 45 minutes and think in our heads of something that was educational that we didn't expect it to be, like whether it was like sitting next to someone on a plane and, you know, having them tell us about, you know, being a surgeon, and, you know, like whatever it could be, we've all learned things in unexpected ways. And I like that, you know, Kevin, that you're kind of like saying like, this is a this question is almost like a trick, because this prompt, because you don't know if it's positive or negative. And obviously it's both, or it has the option of being both, but you know, to make sure people aren't just kind of like, oh, I don't have any big barriers. Student wrote a great one about stuttering. I had, you know, I don't want to talk about one, but there's one right now, students writing about being in the shadow of someone else and how that was a barrier. You know, like there are all sorts of things that students can do here. Let's look at moving to the next one. And this, the educational barrier, that goes to the same thing as most significant challenge. Like, don't tell us a significant challenge you've had if it's not something that is, you know, worthy of competing against other people's significant challenges. But what words of advice do you have about the significant challenge one? Is it along the lines of what you were saying, Kevin, about like kind of breaking it down and telling us what, I don't know if it was you that someone said that, like about, oh, maybe it was you, Matt, about like you took the pill and then what happened, what changed, and all these things. So what things do we kind of talk to students about significant challenge that is important for them to know?
I think that's one that really demands, I think Matt was talking about, being honest about what happened and being vulnerable. If you are going to choose to have this conversation, then it's, I think, important to lean into it and not be trying to hold back. And I understand that for some people this prompt may be too personal and that may not be the right prompt for you. But I think if you are going to go down the route, it's antiseptic, I think is the word you use, Scott. I think avoiding making it too clinical and being personal and vulnerable is very important.
I think that's a great note. Like, I like the use of the words "lean into it," because it is something. It's, you know, if someone's going to write about the death of someone they loved, or someone's going to write about, you know, I have a student that's writing about coming out of the closet right now, and he wrote it in such a way that I was like, I'm sure this was very difficult for you, but this essay doesn't make it sound difficult. This essay just makes it sound like you just, you know, you're like, hey, mom, dad, guess what? Like, pass the salt. And it really, you know, for him, I was like, was it this way? He's like, no, it's still not that way. Like, I still have friction. It's still, you know, it's still a big thing. I'm going to go away to college and it's not going to be resolved. And I was like, tap into that. And I had this is a long time ago, I had a student write an essay about having, you know, like childhood cancer. And he wrote it in such a way that after he finished it, he messaged me and said, he goes, everyone thinks it's good, I don't like it. And I said, why? He goes, because it's, excuse my French, he said it's bullshit. And I go, so what do you want to do? He goes, I feel like saying F cancer. I said, so write a free write where you start out with F cancer, don't censor yourself, go for it, go crazy. And he wrote that, and he wrote a full page document that he read, that he sent to me, and I read it, and I literally had tears streaming out of my eyes because it was so painful to read. And I was like, not that we need to kind of make the admissions officers cry, but can you capture a little bit of that lightning in the bottle so that when you are bringing it as an essay, that some of that pain is there rather than doing the clinical version. So if you're going to go to this one, you kind of got to commit to it. Like, this is not one that you half commit, or else choose a different one. And don't worry also about having 3 joyous essays and 1 painfully heartbreaking essay. That's totally fine. Any final words on that one? Anyone?
You talking about the
Cancer one?
Yeah, the closet made me think of this too, is that I think there is a little bit of a pressure to wrap it up at the end, and I learned so much from it and everything's great. And it absolutely is important to talk about how your life has changed and maybe if you have learned something from it. But I think also it's important to understand that it does not need to feel resolved. It's your life and it's still happening potentially. And I think that can feel more difficult to write. You want to wrap it up with a pretty bow, but that's, I don't think, is not always necessary or honest.
You're 100% right. And I think students, I think, you know, we love you parents, but sometimes the parents are like, don't let them think that you don't know what you want to be when you grow up. The colleges won't accept you. The colleges know you're 17 or 18, and they know that, like, you know, people in their 20s or 30s are still struggling with who and what they want to be. So it's okay to have resolution. I would say actually a lack of resolution. I would actually say call attention to that lack of resolution. Use that to show something that you are still aware and you are still learning and you are still going through this. It makes the essay feel very immediate. Like if he says, even as I write this essay, my parents still aren't speaking to me, you know, in other than just one syllable answers. Like that's like accept that kid to make them feel better. You know, like maybe not quite that way, but you know what I'm saying. So moving on to the next one, an academic subject that inspires you. All right. So what's the important part of this one? And why is this essay one of the ones that we do encourage a lot of students to do? Any thinking?
It's a way for people to get passionate.
It is a way for people to get passionate. And why is it important for the college to know they're passionate about this particular thing per se?
I mean, I think two things. I think it goes to just seeing how like living with passion or how passionate someone can be, period, with anything. But also it could have to do with their major.
Yes.
You know, like what they're wanting to pursue at the UC, and like really gives testament to why they'd be a great student there, you know?
It's my number one question because, you know, everyone on this team and other people at Blue Train all kind of have different specialties. A lot of our specialties overlap. But one of the ones that I do a lot is majors with people. Like I walk through, I help them pick, you know, the difference between environmental studies, environmental science, environmental studies, BA, BS, and I kind of go through all that. And one of the things I always ask these students is like, are you doing the academic subject one for the UCs? And they say, yeah. And I'm like, well, what are you writing it on? And they'll say something like math. And I'm like, oh, but you want to be, you know, like a history major or something like that. Not that that's automatically problematic, but it is really good if a student can like show their interest for biology. Start out in, the student who is always, on her stomach in the grass with a magnifying glass looking at bugs, and then how that translated into something when she was in, bio in ninth grade, and then she took bio AP. So little girl as first paragraph, bio classes as second paragraph, third paragraph, she's talking about like, biological systems and how she sees them breaking down and how she wants to be a part of the solution. That's just like a super pat version of a structure, but that can move very well. And that's why like my chemistry student starts out his essay about burning a hole in his kitchen floor. His mom sending him into the garage with all of his chemistry kits. And the neighbors thought he was like a bomber and all these things. And just a funny little essay, but he's like, I love chemistry. I love material sciences. I love these things. I look at my phone case and I wonder what it's made out of. So I think it's really important and helpful. And for example, UC Santa Barbara is the College of Creative Studies. Every single student that I've seen that has gotten accepted to CCS has been because they've written an essay about how they look at something in a creative way. They look at biology, chemistry, physics, computing, like your student, Celeste, with the problem solving with the creative side. That would be a good essay for College of Creative Studies in computing at Santa Barbara. And of course, you might be applying to different majors at different schools, but it's still wise for you to kind of latch on to something. And the worst version of this is in freshman year I took, in sophomore year I took, in college I want to take, and I see those a lot too. So we do need to move it, and they even hint at it, move it out of the classroom. But in the last like 10 minutes or so, because I know we're trying to wrap it up, what other tips might someone have about the academic subject one? Anybody? Or
yeah, just hitting real quick, the thing you said about ways that you've pursued this outside the classroom. Sometimes kids feel handicapped, like, well, I haven't had an internship or like a job, or I haven't gone to a camp related to this thing. And while if you do have those things, that's fantastic. And by all means, let's write about them. Like there are other ways that you can pursue information, right? Like whether it's going to the library, researching things on your own, going down a rabbit hole on YouTube, right? As long as you find a way to write passionately and succinctly about how you pursue this outside of the classroom, I think it's something we should definitely include.
That's a really good point. Like, when a student says they watch, surgeries on YouTube, gross, but you know, you know, like, but they watch something like the rabbit hole on YouTube. I talk about a lot about that because, you know, I watch my own son, you know, he goes in and like learns everything he can about every single band and everything like that. And he goes down rabbit holes all the time. And he doesn't need an internship for that. Students don't need that, especially in the time of COVID, where a lot of the stuff isn't happening for anyone. So you can either sit on your hands and say, I don't have anything, or you can say, this is how I've been using my time, you know, and I've been exploring. Even conversations with people. You know, the first thing I do when I talk to someone is I talk about, you know, the environment. You know, like the girl you were talking about who did the braid essay, you know, she wanted to talk about classics with a lot of people. In one of her essays, she says, you know, they say Latin is dead, but not dead to me, you know, and she kind of like went in how she goes down all these kind of avenues of exploration of Latin and conversations. And she looks at a dollar bill, she hears things, and it's always Latin is super alive because it is everywhere she looks. And that is, you know, something where she can do that. That doesn't need to be an internship or etc. The last actual prompt says, what have you done to make your school or community a better place? I will just go on the record and say, if you can do this one, if you have anything to say, it's a good one because the UC's primary objective is to build a better California. That means take students who've worked hard in high school, have done community service well in high school, educate them very well, and then release them out into the state to hopefully be good people that will continue to give back. That is the UC's prime objective. So if we understand that, then this essay here can be a good one to use. But again, I think we've already said, just like with the leadership essay and other ones, it doesn't need to be so kind of like activity, capital letter oriented. So what are some things that you might talk about your students with on this particular topic? Anybody?
One of the things that I tend to really focus on if they're doing the community service one is which one of your community service activities, if they have a lot, did you feel like you had the greatest impact? Which one did you feel like you learned the most from? Which one were you the most excited to do? So that it's really about what you are passionate about in terms of community service instead of like just what looks the best.
Yes, because we see in their hierarchy, they always show, oh, this one like is the one that everyone knows, but there might be something someone did for a very short time that was very important to them. Like you said, you're mining for the qualitative aspects of that activity, and you're trying to bring that over into a bigger arena so the student can really show that, which is in the essay. Excellent. What other things would you guys say about this one that you suggest people do? Anything?
Just think about community in general. What community are you part of? What kind of community? Even if that's obviously there's big ones like just LA, right? Or there can be community of being big David Bowie fans on the internet or something, you know? I mean, there's a million different ways to go.
Yeah.
Community can mean so many different things, so many different people. So what does it mean to you is often a starting off point I have.
And what does helping mean, right?
Yeah.
You know, I always bring this example up. My student who called me one day and he said, I want to write about the community one because you said it was really important. I was like, great. And he goes, but I've never done any community service. And I was like, oh. And he's like, but I really do think I make community a better place. And I was like, oh. And I was like, how? He goes, by my smile. And I said, oh. You know, it was like this kind of thing. But then he actually made a really good pitch. He said, when I walk into my class every single day, the first thing I do is I smile at my teachers. When they almost recognize that. When my parents are arguing or I walk into the house, I smile at them. When my friends are there coming up and they're just sitting there scrolling at their phones, I walk up with a big smile. He goes, I understand that smiles are important and I make this a part of my conscious behavior to add positivity. And I was like, hell, dude, I actually love this essay now. And it actually made me smile. And it's, you know, my whole thing about putting like smile emojis after everything, like these things matter. Smile molecules. And these things do end up, you know, changing the world. And so I thought that was a great way to do it. And I think that we should always encourage, you know, students to kind of find that. We're running a little bit close, so I'm going to just get to this last one really quickly. Beyond what has already been shared in your application, what do you believe makes you stand out as a strong candidate for admissions to the University of California? So it's like, what hasn't already been said that you can say? And I would say that students probably do this one the least. Would you guys say the same? Can you think of any examples where they did need to use it?
Sometimes, like, I find that this is for a student, like, to a space to write about, like, cultural heritage, you know, because they couldn't find a way to kind of fit it into one of the other ones, but it is important. Maybe they're first generation American, or their parents were, and like their specific culture like plays into their life a lot. That's one thing that comes up for this one for me.
That's an excellent point. I have a student who's doing that right now with religion, you know, and also, but it's a very unique religion. It's not, I've never even heard of it. But the other thing is that quite often, to Matt's point, students can write supplements for other schools, like about the community or like the diversity, and then they can kind of take that and co-opt that information and then use it for number 8, because if you guys look at supplements, you know that supplements, and that'll be our next one, is I'll talk all about supplements, but supplements, we know quite often ask about diversity and your ability to accept and embrace and be a part of a diverse landscape. So I think that they can use that as what Matt was saying in that way, because everyone wants to write fewer essays, right? That's the goal. Write fewer essays and make them better. Same amount of time, but just make them all better. Any last other ones that you noticed on this one? David?
You see my hand going down for the mute to unmute.
Well, I see everyone, like everyone has these little micro movements that are like kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually say that this isn't the least popular one for my students.
Good.
Yeah, like I think like the way that I usually preface it is like, okay, like what's something that you care about them knowing that would not fit anywhere on the rest of these, you know? And the range has been honestly kind of ridiculous, not just this year, but across the years. I mean, like one student a few years ago, I think is going to Berkeley now, wrote about like being old at heart. It was this like, it like he had like so many 70-year-old friends because he played golf. Like I'd show up at his house and I'd be like, oh, hey, Bob, how's, you know?
I love that.
Yeah, like and like he would religiously go to bed at like 8 o'clock. He'd be like, yeah, I'm putting my wine down at 7:15. I'm like, all right. And like but at the same time he was super
bran muffins.
yeah, exactly. He was very religious about his tea time. There were all these things that but again, like he was also very youthful and vibrant. It was about this like kind of contrast of like, yeah, I'll like be blasting Travis Scott with my friends in the car, but I will also tell you to turn down your music if, you know. So it's stuff like that. I think, yeah, it's cultural things are definitely possible, but I almost think of this as the wild card essay, you know, like, okay, what's something about you that like you just really want to talk about that doesn't fit in these other ones, you know?
That's excellent. All right, we're gonna close it out. Just a quick go around. Everyone just like in 1 minute or so, just kind of say what you think is the most important for a student once they have their drafts done. Like once they have their drafts done, like how do they take that to the next polish? I'll start out and say that I think that students really need to look at that and see if there's more interesting ways they can start each paragraph and really try to kind of rewrite the whole thing. Don't cut and paste. And my secret pet peeve, don't use those comments on Google Docs. I know some of you guys love it, but like I see students like half writing in the essay and then half writing over here. And I don't even know how their brains kind of make flow. That's a 350-word essay. Just rewrite the whole thing. Try to come back from a different angle. Experiment. That's what would be my thing. Experiment until you catch fire. Hannah.
I think I would say start thinking more about structure. Maybe that's been forefront in your mind, but I think for a lot of students, their first draft tends to be the glob. And now is an opportunity to think about, how do I make a beginning and middle and end? How do I find 2 or 3 paragraphs and make each one of them distinct and interesting?
Perfect. Celeste.
I always like to make people go deeper. So, I don't know, asking questions about, okay, like what is this showing about you? I'm trying to make this general instead of like trying to think of each question.
But going
Like,
deeper
what is it?
is good. But going deeper
Yeah.
is like important. And do you just have them do more free writes, or what do you do?
I usually just ask them questions and then maybe write about something that's come up while we're talking about this, or trying to get them to be more self-reflective about like what it actually shows about them, what's it actually meaning to them, how it's actually impacting their life.
Excellent, excellent. Kevin?
With the UCs especially, I often think about in terms of like scenes, you know. So I think because there's more perception of the UCs is like you just write to them like it's your resume again. People are less apt to really put a lot of good, strong imagery in each paragraph, not just in the whole thing, but I want each individual paragraph to have like a thing that you keep in mind after you finished reading it, right? I mean, you ultimately, the point is standing out, and standout imagery is one of the best ways to stand out. So yes, that's something I think is key.
Imagery to make things stick, in a sense.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
Good. Excellent. Matt?
Oh man.
Should we come back to you?
No, I got a couple things. One would be, don't repeat the prompt in the first line of your first paragraph, please. You know, that's valuable space that we can be using for something else. And then kind of like off Kevin, I would say like starting in the moment is always a good place to start. You know, if you could do it, if you can be in the moment in all of your paragraphs, that's great. But like certainly something at the beginning for me, I think, especially for people that don't write that often, it's a great way to like kick things off. Get the reader hooked by, you know, putting us in the action.
And so are you okay with students being creative?
I am very anti-creativity. Big fan of, what's that book? Fahrenheit 451? No, of course. Yeah, I think there's definitely room for creativity. Creativity, I like to say for UCs, it's creativity and clarity, right? So be creative, but err on the side of making sure that the reader knows what this club does, what this organization does, who's in it. You know, it's like we've got to hit our ABC facts in this one, maybe a little bit more than other creative writing, but there's definitely still room to think of creativity in terms of structure, dialogue, how are we coming into paragraphs. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, good. I knew you were going to say that answer, but it's like, it's just so sad that so many other people just kind of almost talk about the UCs as their non-creative kind of prompts, and it's troublesome. It makes me sad. Melissa? Yeah.
I kind of jump off of Celeste here. I totally agree. I always want my students to go deeper with these. I think the UCs are such a great opportunity to like let your admissions officer in for just a moment, and like it's just getting a morsel of who you are. It's just getting a small moment with you. And so I always ask after that first draft, okay, what is the thing that I'm not saying? What is the thing that I've left out because I thought it was too personal, or I thought it was going to make me look bad? Why did I leave that out? So thinking about what is the other thing that I can include that could like zhuzh this up a bit.
Great. I mean, I love all this stuff. It makes everything like more like electric as everyone's trying to get there. David?
So I'm going to have a combination of pretty much what everyone said. I think the going deeper thing, and that can be a lot of things. That can be, you know, starting with a moment, like what Matt was saying. That could be going deeper with an image that's still stuck in your brain, you know, going off what Ken was saying. I think one thing is always one thing to consider, no pun intended, the things to consider questions, you know, like if you're kind of reiterating on a past draft and you're polishing, look back at those things to consider questions, because those are often a way to go a lot deeper. Like, how do you define creativity? What was a problem in your community that you wanted to fix? You know, like these are ways to go deeper. So yeah, just go deeper.
Go deeper. You guys are awesome. Always super insightful points of view. I think that the word to the students is to not take these for granted, to experiment, to go deeper, to write and rewrite. If the UCs are a primary target for you, you should be taking these very seriously because they can change the game. And I think that when grades are not in your control, when tests or being able to test are in your control, and a lot of things are out of your control, these are in your control. And you don't have to be the world's best writer. You don't have to be a humanities person to do these very well. It just takes time and care. So good luck, everybody out there. And thank you, everybody. Thanks, guys. Bye, everybody. There you go.